What's going on, everyone? Anthony Drew Gary here, host of the How To Show, where we talk about optimizing life, money, and happiness one how to at a time. We are back to talking about retirement in this week's episode of the How To Show. And assuming that you did not buy and sell GameStop in the past week at the exact right moment, hopefully you're still thinking about retirement because it's still important if it's something you aspire to do one day. And the GameStop reference is only a good one if you're watching this in the last week of January, but we'll carry forward. And in previous episodes of the show, I have talked about the ideas of how to become a millionaire. I've talked about compound interest. I've talked about different opportunities for retirement savings and what those different accounts look like and how they have advantages and disadvantages. And this week I'm going to talk about how to determine how much money it takes to retire. And in doing so, I'm going to explain why a lot of the financial calculators that you'll find on the internet are not necessarily set up in the proper way. I really think they're going about it the wrong way, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But the best way to do that is to actually look at some of these calculators. So let's go ahead and switch over to Zoom, and I'll share my screen. We'll look at the calculators, and we'll talk about what does and what doesn't make sense, and how we can best set ourselves up to figure out what number of retirement savings it'll take to retire one day. All right. So if you pull up an internet browser and you type in retirement calculator, you're going to get a ton of hits, both from websites that you've probably heard of, like Bankrate. That's what this one is, and then some other folks in the financial space just giving the same sort of advice. But all of these calculators, they pretty much all look the same, and they're all inherently flawed, at least in my opinion. And so let's talk about why. When you scroll down to this calculator, you've got basically three main first questions. How old are you now? How old do you want to be when you retire? And how much money you make? And so we click off of that one. We go to NerdWallet. We basically see the same sort of things. This is how old I am, and this is how much money I make. And so then we jump over to Smart Asset, and one of the first questions they ask is, how much money do you make? And they're basing your retirement goals and your ultimate retirement calculated number of how much money you need to retire based on how much money you make. And that's not really the right way to go about it, because how much money you make doesn't really tell the story of your life, your spending, and your future habits. And so if you think about this a different way, if you frame the calculation on how much money you spend, it starts to get a lot more detailed, specific to your situation. In this example right here, the number for income has a plug-in number of 73,042. And that might work, but what's it look like if you make 70 grand and you spend only 40? Or what's it look like if you make 70 grand, but you spend 90 and you've got yourself underwater? In each of these instances, how much money you make starts to become irrelevant. And so the best way to frame how to calculate your financial retirement number and how much money you need to retire is based off of how much money you spend. And so when we start to frame it that way, it becomes a little more clear. And so let's just use a couple of examples here. You've got to find some way to have an idea of how much money you spend. And there's really only one way to do that, and it's to track the amount that you're spending right now. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can do it by saving your receipts and plugging them into something like Excel. If you do almost all of your spending through either your checking account debit card or a credit card, you can start to use receipts or statements from your bank. Or you can use some sort of app to do your budgeting and your spending. Our family uses EveryDollar. But ultimately, you've got to have some sort of idea of how much you spend in order to extrapolate that out into how much you're going to need for your retirement. And so let's just pull up a calculator for giggles, and let's say that your family spends $45,000 a year. And so let's think about what that means in a couple of different senses. 45 grand is what you spend right now. And so you've got to do a little bit of thinking of, okay, this is how much we spend now, but how much are we going to spend in the future? And for now, let's not worry about inflation. Let's just worry about the hard brass costs. And so if your scenario is that you're spending 45 grand now, the two big things that I want to think about here are housing and dependents. And so let's say 45 grand is what your cost is right now. But if you've got a house at some point later down the road, you may be able to, and especially most specifically, if you own that house, hopefully you will see a day where your mortgage is paid off and that's not part of your plan anymore. And so you start to frame it that way. And the second thought to that is that if you've got children at home, at some point they're hopefully going to be off of your family payroll. And so this 45 grand may go up or it may go down over time based on the circumstances that you find yourself in. Another circumstance you'll consider into this is healthcare, but that's really person to person specific. And you'll have to do some calculations as to what your healthcare costs are. But for the sake of it, let's say that we're at 45 grand. Now, what do we do with that number? Thankfully, somebody's already done some research on it, and that research is the Trinity study. And so the Trinity study basically comes up with the concept of the 4% rule. And what's the 4% rule? That's a great question. At a really basic level, it says that based on historical data from retirement accounts over the last decade upon decade upon decade, folks who spent no more than 4% of the amount of money they have available for retirement, statistically, about 95% of them never run out of money during their retirement years. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's at least a good way to get us thinking about how much money it might take to retire. And so, you can be a skeptic or a cynic and say, oh, that's only 95% of people get away with that. What about those other 5%? So let's find a way to insulate it a little further. If your spending for the year is 45 grand, let's add a little bit of cushion to that. And so we'll add 5 grand to it. And so let's call your spending 50 grand, just so that you can have a little bit of cushion between reality and what it could be. And the whole concept of the Trinity study includes the compound interest. It includes the average expected growth of the overall stock market. It includes inflation. And so as a general rule, this gives you a good baseline to start to have the conversation of how much money you ultimately need to save. And so if you're going to spend 4% of everything you have in your retirement years, you need to come up with what's an acceptable number and to allow that to happen. And so a little bit of higher level multiplication and division. The inverse of 4% would be 25 times the amount that you're going to spend. So we can take that $50,000 and we can multiply it by 25, and we come up with $1,250,000. So to circle it all back, bring it back home, what does that really mean? It means that statistically, if you have $1,250,000 saved for retirement, and you plan to spend $50,000 in today's dollars for retirement, statistically, you are not going to run out of money. And so if this is good information to start to set up the framework. And so ultimately what you're going to want to do is compare $1,250,000, if this is your situation, to the amount of money you have saved for retirement now and the amount of time you have between right now and the time that you expect to retire. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about how to confirm we're on track to retire. But this is to start to frame the question. How much money do you need to retire? How do you calculate your financial retirement number so that you can retire one day? As a general rule, it is 25 times your annual expenses. That's going to bring this episode of the show to a close, and I hope that you're able to take something away from this episode and use it in your own life. If you plan on retiring one day, this is information that will hopefully help you start aiming toward a point so that you can start to set up retirement goals. And I think that's important, and hopefully you do too. And if there's anybody that you know who could benefit from watching this video, be it young or old, everybody starts naked, as they say, or everybody's born naked, and I think everybody has an opportunity to learn this stuff. And so if you know somebody that might benefit from it, share the video with them. And as well as doing that, hit the like button to let the YouTube algorithm know that this is a video worth sharing with other people who you don't know and I don't know, but they can still benefit from the content. If you like what I'm doing and you like watching the show, hit the subscribe button. You'll be the first to know about new video as it comes out. And if you have any comments or ideas for future topics on the show, leave a comment and I'll respond to each and every one of those. And as always, if you find yourself listening to podcasts every once in a while, you can hit up the How To Show there on the podcast player of your choice. And if you have anybody that listens to podcasts instead of watching YouTube, you can find a way to share the content with them that way. Until next time, this is Anthony Drew Gary, host of the How To Show, signing off.